Welcome to the Lawyering Peace podcast series, where we explore the art of diplomacy, the practice of peace building, and the legal, economic, and policy frameworks that shape the global order. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University, and the founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group. Today, I am delighted to welcome my good friend, Ambassador Joachim Rücker, to the program. Joachim, welcome.
It's great to be with you, Paul, and thanks for inviting.
Well, today's episode continues our exploration of paradigm shifts in the international system. Joachim and I will examine what the current transformation of the global order means for the United Nations, for the future of human rights, and for the institutions that have defined the international system since 1945. Joachim is one of Germany's most distinguished diplomats. His career has taken him from the German Bundestag, where he served as foreign policy advisor, to the Social Democratic Parliamentary Group, to postings in Dar es Salaam, Detroit, Vienna, and Sarajevo, where he served as ambassador and deputy high representative for the Administration and Finance Office of the High Representative. He also served as a mayor of the city of Sindelfingen, and from 2006 to 2008 as the special representative of the UN Secretary General for Kosovo and the head of UNMIK, of the UN mission in Kosovo. Now, in 2015, he was appointed president of the UN Human Rights Council, the first German diplomat ever elected to that position, where he presided over some of the most consequential debates in the Council's history, including the appointment of the first special rapporteur on the right to privacy in the digital age. And I'm also very proud of the fact that Joachim is a senior peace fellow with the Public International Law and Policy Group. And I want to share a fun fact. Most of our listeners know that I'm from Cupertino, but I've never shared that I actually grew up on Rücker Drive.
Oh.
So for 25 years of my life, my home address was Rücker Drive, Cupertino, California. And since our family is part German, we took a lot of pride in that notion that we were living on Rücker Drive in Cupertino. So Joachim, it's a really genuine pleasure to have you with us today. Let's kick off with your origin story. Did you wake up one day in middle school and say, I want to be an economist, I want to be a diplomat? Or did you wake up and say, I want to do 6 different professions, politics, local politics, national politics, post-conflict reconstruction? What shaped your interest in this amazing career that you've had over the last number of decades?
Well, my motto, as you might have seen on my website, is actually all politics and business is local. So I've always had a great interest in local politics. So that's why I became a mayor later. And that started already when I was a student. But I was also interested in foreign policy, international politics. I was fascinated at the time, as most of my compatriots, at least if they were my age, around 20 or so, by Willy Brandt's, politics and policies, and by his aura. And that made me actually not only admire him and his politics, but made me later join the Social Democratic Party and engage with them later as an advisor of the Social Democrats Parliamentary Group, which you mentioned. I was fascinated by the aura and the political impact of Willy Brandt at the time. I also spent a couple of years abroad already before I went to university to study economics, mainly at the University of Freiburg. Then I went for 18 months to Israel. I worked in a kibbutz for a year. That was my substitute for the military service. That was a model that was encouraged by the system at the time. And I also spent some years in the US, including my high school diploma, which I got when I spent a senior year at the Kalani High School in Honolulu. So that already engaged me in a way with the international politics on the one hand, but also I was deeply rooted in my local communities, and maybe that came together later.
Joachim, I would have used your high school diploma from Hawaii as a fun fact, had I remembered that from our earlier conversations. It does illustrate, though, the eclectic degree of your expertise. And that's what I want to tap into now as we move into some of these questions about the paradigm shift, the United Nations, and human rights. When we look at the international system today, not sort of as an abstract theoretical, but as from the perspective of two people who are oftentimes in the room when decisions are being made about global governance, economic cohesion, human rights. What is your sense of this moment in time in which we're living? Is this the paradigm shift? Is this the usual zig and zag of international affairs and the global order? There's lots of difficulties facing multilateral institutions. Yeah, it's always that way. Or we should wake up and stay focused because we are undergoing a paradigm shift and there's going to need to be some thinking on how to navigate this paradigm shift. Where do you come out on this conversation?
I think we witness a paradigm shift. And in my personal realm, I started feeling this shift for the first time really heavily when during the first Trump administration, because there was a different approach with that administration. Before, I think disrespect from certain leaders around the world for the rule-based system would be more or less implicit under a layer of formal acceptance of the rule-based order. For example, with cultural relativism, when it came to human rights, that people said, yeah, okay, that's fine, but we need to relativize that because, culturally, we do not believe in, let's say, the abolition of the death penalty or whatever. With Trump, it seemed that maybe for the first time, very openly, disrespect was explicit. And that, of course, did make a difference and still does make a difference. I'm convinced that this outright disrespect, not an implicit or under a layer of formal acceptance, emboldened people like Putin to do what he did later, especially the aggression in 2022. And I think it got somehow even more problematic in the now second Trump administration, which sends even stronger messages of open disregard. But there's also something which I have called in the past a lifeline to the rule-based order that is even extended from the Trump presidency, I think, or from the Trump administration. For example, the Gaza peace agreement, including the peace board, at least with its Gaza mandate, was legitimized by a UN Security Council resolution, which is a lifeline to the rule-based system. And I think we have no choice but building on that because we continue to need the UN and the rule-based system. And I would add that if I had to choose between sort of the formal acceptance of international law and the whole body of international law and outright disrespect, I would always choose the former, because if countries' leaders formally accept the rules, then you can argue and you can come maybe even to, I don't know, UNGA resolution or ideally even a UNSC resolution, and maybe ideally also come to a condemnation or a strong wording. And I wouldn't underestimate naming and shaming with regard to international breaches of law, let alone maybe sort of interventions that derive from Chapter 6 or 7 of the Charter. So I think it's not nothing that we have, including even the actions of the US administration, and we need to build on that.
Well, Joachim, let's pick up on the United Nations as a lifeline. The United Nations turns 80 years old this year. Is it past its sell-by date, as the Brits would say, or the phrase the Brits would use? It was created in 1945, roughly 50 states. There were the 5 permanent members for various geopolitical reasons. Today, it has 193 members, and it's facing challenges that were never envisioned in 1945: cyber, artificial intelligence, climate change. Is it well equipped? And is it the right forum to be addressing these issues? Now, some will say it is past its sell by date and it was designed for peace and security and it should stick with that, and it's overexpanded, it's bloated, and it does everything but does nothing well. Others will say, right, it's the only place in the global community where all 193 states can sit together and exchange ideas, innovate, brainstorm, and also name and shame where necessary. Where do you come out on this? Is the United Nations fit for purpose now in 2026?
Well, we had a summit, I think it was last year, Summit of the Future, that focused on these questions and tried to focus on a revitalized agenda for the UN, including its institutions. I think if we did not have the UN or would lose it somehow, we would have to reinvent them. They still provide the framework for international law and legitimacy. And even, leaders or people who would disagree with the way it operates would at least formally agree that you need a framework for international law and legitimacy. So, yeah, we would probably end up reinventing the United Nations. That's why I think in general they are still quite relevant, maybe even more relevant than ever before, because for the reasons you just named. That doesn't mean, of course, and I'm sure we will embark on that, it doesn't change the fact that we should try to reform the UN from within as much as possible and some of its mechanisms. But yes, the starting point should be that if we wouldn't have them, we would have to reinvent them, and they're absolutely necessary. That is my starting point, I think. Most of the not only leaders in the 193 states, but also of the people of the world would agree with that.
Well, Joachim, let's have that conversation about reform. If you were given a magic blue baseball cap that says United Nations on it, and this magic baseball cap let you implement 3 reforms that were politically realistic and genuinely consequential, what 3 reforms would you implement at the United Nations?
I think I still have my UN base cap in the basement, so I have to look for it. So I can do this literally, but I know that this is a metaphor. And if I would name 3, 3 areas where reform would be most needed, I would start with the Security Council reform along the main proposals, like maybe the G4 proposal, plus, of course, 1 or 2 members from Africa, like South Africa and Egypt, as new permanent or semi-permanent members with the council that is like 20 plus. I would ideally add that limiting veto use would also be good, including, that maybe implementing the charter better in the sense that if you are involved in a conflict, then you should not vote. That should be doable without a charter change. Other limitations of the veto power have also been proposed in the past, including, I think there's good proposals from Mexico and other states on how to reform the UN veto mechanism in the ESC. Having said that, this would be my first priority. The second priority would be, so now this was about the first pillar of the UN, peace and security. Then, of course, we have the sustainable development pillar, and we have the human rights pillar. And with regard to the human rights pillar, that would be my second priority, namely elevating the Human Rights Council to a real third pillar of the system by making it a primary organ, and also giving a primary organ, not a subsidiary of the GA, and by giving it more resources and sharpened instruments, including the special procedures and other related instruments and methods. My third recommendation would probably relate to the humanitarian system, where, in my view, there's still not enough focus on giving refugees and IDPs as early as possible in the process the agency to feel as citizens of their camp or their urban surroundings, feeling as acting as consumers and as producers as well. They are still too much, in my view, objects of care instead of being allowed to actually, act in a camp or suburban atmosphere. So I'm actually a chairperson of an NGO that advocates sustainable development zones as an instrument to help vulnerable groups, especially IDPs and refugees, but also other vulnerable groups in either a slum or a camp situation to gain the agency much sooner than under the current system by applying the special legal framework that is something like a special economic zone, and that can be standardized in these situations. That's sort of the third thing I would do. There's, of course, more. I mean, you asked for 3 proposals. I have taken to the proposal that the new UNSG could maybe create a unit to support negotiations, intra and extra UN, as proposed by some. So I could go on, but you asked for my essentials.
These questions oftentimes prompt so much thinking and so much understanding that we could go on for quite some time. Let me pick up on something that you mentioned with respect to the Security Council, peace and security. It was designed for Chapter 6, Chapter 7 authorization of the use of force, Chapter 6 peacekeeping. And there was a pretty good trend for decades of abiding by the legal rules of the game and seeking Security Council authorization for the use of force that wasn't strictly in self-defense. But lately, we've seen states engaging in the use of force without even seeking Security Council authorization. Venezuela, Iran, the United States actions there, other places around the globe. How worried are we about the fact that some of the formerly more rule-abiding states are now acting outside the accepted legal framework of Security Council authorization for the use of force? Is this just the sort of a zig or a zag, or are we seeing the erosion of a system that was designed to tightly control the use of force, and we should be deeply worried and lose sleep over it?
I think we should be deeply worried over the disrespect of the basic charter rules with the use of force, threatening or using force against sovereign members, disrespect for territorial integrity and sovereignty. And there is a very, very worrying trend. And I think the successful, what we could call bullying, or, acting like a bully, including threatening with force or using force, and at the same time disrespect for the rules, that of course emboldens others. As I said before, I think that the open disrespect in the first Trump administration contributed to the fact that Putin felt he could invade Ukraine in 2022, and maybe it wasn't the only reason, but it was certainly something that would contribute to it, at least in my view. And smaller states, of course, pay the price for that. If there is a disrespect for the rules, especially use of force, threatening with force. So what we have to do, and what smaller states, and I would include my own and many others, so the only thing they can do in the current situation is they have to work together even more to reverse the trend. And there is, in principle, no better place for that than the UN itself, as well as regional organizations, including regional organizations for defense like NATO. But we have to note that there is still I would still call it an overwhelming majority in the UNGA strongly condemning the Russian aggression of Ukraine. So there is still this element of nations getting together, states getting together and doing something about a situation where, a bully situation. And there's results, even if it's only quote unquote a strong condemnation in no uncertain terms. I think that naming and shaming is generally underrated. So I think that also has an effect on the perpetrator. There's also examples how states can work together in regional organizations in order to stop perpetrators or to stop sort of this conflict with international law. For example, when NATO member US ventilated an attack on Denmark, including using force to proceed to an annexation of Greenland, all the other NATO members got together and came up with a clear stop sign saying this is not going to happen. We will jointly work against that. And I think that did leave an impact. I hope so, at least. So it is possible if you look at what the GA does, if you look at what partly also the Security Council does, what happens in regional organizations, including like NATO, it is possible to deter attacks on the rules, including from inside, as was in the case of NATO, at least for now. I'm confident that we can strengthen that and even maybe create a momentum to reverse the trend, especially when you see the results of bully politics, like, let's say, in the Iran war, where you have a status quo ante minus as a result of a war that costs lives and costs a lot of money, and you have less than you had before. That is something, and that might contribute to a reversal of the trend.
Well, Joachim, you're always so thoughtful about the role of the UN and, warts and all, where it's effective, where it's not effective. I want to ask you a very simple question, but then I'll explain why I'm asking this question, which is today, how do you make the case for the United Nations? And you've already partly answered this by saying if we didn't have it, we would probably all get together and build it. But what I've found surprising over the last, let's just say, 12 months is that the global community, not just the Americans, and particularly the Americans, but also the global community, are entertaining a lot of ideas, that they're entertaining more ideas outside of the box than they are entertaining ideas inside the box. Transactionalism is back in vogue. We had the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, with his famous Davos speech where he says, we're taking the sign out of the window. And the sign said, rule of law, legal-based order. And he's like, well, we're taking that out of the window and we're going to form a coalition of middle powers, sort of cutting loose the global south. And then we're going to go in a transactional face-to-face approach with the Americans and the Chinese. The Chinese have been toying with different scenarios or infrastructures for quite some time. They're testing them out on the Philippines, it seems, with their attempted acquisition of some of these islands through intimidation. There's a lot of conversation about different ways of structuring the global order and doing business. And if we're raising the UN flag, what is the case for the United Nations in an environment where everyone seems to be considering different options for structuring the world order? Why go with option A, the United Nations?
Well, maybe I should start by saying that I think not all disruption is negative, and not all thinking out of the box is negative. And I think we can all profit from new approaches, like the approach I was just talking about, where we actually advocate a special jurisdiction standardized framework to deal better with agglomerations of people in vulnerable situations that are stuck in sort of a status of being objects of care and stuck in the informal economy. So I have as an economist, a certain understanding for thinking out of the box and maybe thinking about your instruments, including some of, from of the economic / including semi-libertarian toolbox. That's all fine as long as we know what we're doing. And I think it's okay to sort of question the effectiveness of the UN and maybe come to new forms in that coalitions of the willing within the UN framework can do more. Like that's something we experience in the EU, where you have the Treaty of Lisbon and you have your basis of the EU treaty. However, you can have coalitions of the willing that are, advancing if others are staying behind and say, we don't want to do this yet, or this is too early. I mean, the euro is a prominent example, but there's also examples, and there should be more, and there will be more relating, let's say, to the EU's foreign policy and the EU's security and defense policy. And we could probably imagine a similar situation in the UN where sort of interested parties, interested states work together, as you have very often in working groups already in the UN, in order to propel a certain proposal or a certain approach. Having said that, I still think that, the UN nevertheless remains the main anchor and the framework for international law and legitimacy. And it has been very successful. That's up for argument, but I would say it's been very successful in creating that framework, in setting universal norms. The weak spot is obviously the consequential implementation. But if we agree that such a framework and that universal norms continue to be extremely important, and who wouldn't agree to that principle, then the case for the UN, I think, is still easily made. And I'm confident that, even if there is a trend away from the UN, the solutions proposed will be under the UN umbrella in one way or another, as we experience in the EU, mutatis mutandis, where you also have groups that are working on certain, policies together as advanced groups, so to speak, avant-garde.
Well, Joachim, let's pivot from the United Nations to artificial intelligence. Now, we could talk for hours about all of the different dimensions of artificial intelligence, but I want to tap into your expertise that you started to gather when you appointed the first UN Special Rapporteur for the right of privacy in 2015, and you had constructed this mandate born out of the concerns about surveillance in the digital age. Not only is AI enhance the ability of states to monitor and suppress dissent, we actually find people cognitively offloading, or governments or states cognitively offloading to AI the responsibility to make decisions that affect people's lives, with some, human in the loop or human on the loop, but seems less and less so. You have the ability with AI to generate, it used to be just trolling, but now it's trolling, it's disinformation, it's deep fakes, it's making the news, generating the news out of whole cloth and conducting information campaigns based upon that. How worried should we be about what the humans are doing with AI? So less of a question of whether AI is going to go rogue and become Skynet and do these things, but more the neutral tool of AI in the hands of humans who are using it to monitor their populations, or in the hands of governments who are using it to monitor populations, suppress dissent. Does the international human rights system have the tools to govern these technologies, or has technology outstripped the ability of the legal regime to meaningfully manage this situation?
Well, when we created the special rapporteur on the right to privacy in the digital age in 2015, I think the trigger at the time was, different governments spying on even allied and other governments in a way that was so obvious that there was a human rights aspect to it. And then Brazil and Germany started an initiative on this broader issue of right to privacy in the digital age. Now, that mandate has been renewed by the Human Rights Council ever since in regular intervals, and the current mandate holder is a very able lady, Ana Brian Nogueras from Uruguay. And the mandate and the topic has obviously expanded a bit in the light of the new circumstances, including AI, of course, and it's now about government surveillance and intelligence gathering. It's about cross-border transfers of personal data. That was a particular angle of the Human Rights Council, and AI systems and automated decision-making, where there is quite some work within the Human Rights Council, but also from the side of the GA. So to answer your question, I think the UN institutions have a number of good answers to the problems you outlined, including the GA with really broad resolutions on digital governance, the digital gaps with regard to countries, with regard to generations, with regard to rich and poor, and how to address the challenges of AI. It's all there. So the whole digital governance system is actually, as it should be, as it should develop, is described in quite relevant resolutions. Now, of course, what is the way forward? Is anybody reading the resolution, so to speak? And here we come again to what we have identified before in the human rights field in particular. Now let's talk about digital governance, that the UN comes up with actually very good norms and action plans. But the problem, I mean, admirable edifices of, norms and proposed actions, but, there's no implementation. There's no follow-up. Now, if we talk about follow-up of these relevant resolutions with digital governance, we should, of course, differentiate between states and big tech. The cynical answer could be that neither states nor big tech has read the relevant resolutions. So what is the way forward with states? Well, I continue to think that the follow-up on these really good and forward-looking resolutions from the GA, but also from the HRC, should be done properly. And if there is gaps in implementation, that should be identified, and there should be, as a first step, the necessary degree of naming and shaming. I don't see that yet happening, but I think the norms and the agenda points are there, the bullet points. So let's follow through and close the digital gaps. That's basically the GA's term. Now, when we come to big tech, of course, or the industry, I would suggest that one would maybe try to integrate the approach from the Global Digital Compact, which was, I think, a part of the Summit of the Future, and take its human rights aspects and include that into the supply chain laws, which we have in different countries and which are building on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So we have at least the human rights angle covered of the digital governance. Now, of course, you might ask, are we in an era where the supply chain laws are flourishing and expanded, or are we in an era where there's a lot of pressure on supply chain laws? And of course, the latter is the case. However, we do have supply chain laws. The EU's has been recently softened, but anyway, it's still there. And we have supply chain laws in other countries. And it is not rocket science to include the human rights aspects of digital governance into the supply chain laws. Now, if somebody says this is not the right time and come back in maybe 5 years, maybe yes, but we need to know where we would like to go. And like 25 years ago, before the UNGP and what happened in the 2010s, nobody even believed we would ever have supply chain laws. And now we have supply chain laws. So why not include that aspect into the supply chain laws? So eventually we could also bring it to the industry, what is concerning us, including the dangers from the digital gaps and the dangers from AI from a human rights perspective, because it all is connected to the human rights of individuals.
Well, Joachim, you've been so generous with your time. I just have two more questions for you. And the penultimate question is, are you an optimist or are you a pessimist? I know you're a realist. And does your realist approach to the future lead you to be optimistic that these reforms will happen with the United Nations, that the global community will continue to acknowledge and recognize the value and the utility of the United Nations? And maybe, we're on the cusp of a new Secretary General. Maybe she'll be able to breathe new life into these reforms and some of these ideas. Or it'd be great if these things happened, but realistically, I can tell you this is actually the path we're likely to go down, and we should be losing some sleep over that path as well. Where do you come out on this?
I come out as confident, more optimist than pessimist, because I think, first of all, I think we already alluded to that, there is tipping points, right? There is tipping points where the politics of disrespect to the rule-based order is producing results that are negative. I was talking about like a war that was started with disrespect of the UN Charter. I think, at least that's my assessment. Others might think differently from a legal point of view. And that produced a status quo ante minus. We had also situations like in Hungary, where you had a tipping point, and all of a sudden, a pretty authoritarian leader was replaced by a pro-European leader. And I think we could probably come to a couple of bullet points where we have experienced tipping points or will experience tipping points where people are starting to be disillusioned with the politics of disrespect for the international order. So because of that mechanism, I think there will be something like a rollback or maybe even a reversal of the trend. Then, of course, I think we will have a certain momentum when the new UN Secretary General comes in. I think she would hopefully create that momentum with aura and program, and that could at least stop, I think, a further decline in public attention for the UN and in compliance with its norms. And I don't think that's far-fetched, because if it plays together with the tipping points I was referring to, then maybe we will see that change. I'm confident. Optimistic is maybe a bit overdoing it, but I'm confident that this can happen.
Well, Joachim, you've shared so many words of wisdom over the course of these last 45 minutes. I want you to leave our young professionals. We have many listeners across the spectrum, mid-career, senior career, retired, but we also have a cohort of young professionals, and I assign these podcasts in my class. So a young professional who's looking at 5 decades ahead of them. They're interested in economic structure. They're interested in the rule of law. They're interested in making a difference. What type of disposition or mindset would you suggest that they consider adopting? And I say this because many of the young professionals are trying on different types of mindsets. They don't want to just be Eeyore and gloomy about the future. They want to, think about ways to impact their own future and the global situation. What mindsets, dispositions have helped you in the past? And what are some of the things that you would suggest that they consider adopting? And what are the things that they might want to commit some or a substantial amount of their time and energy to in order to make a difference, promote the rule of law, promote global inclusivity?
I think what is important for a young diplomat, a young person in public or in private service, is that we need to have an honest dialogue with regard to historical facts and hopefully agreement on the facts. And for me, that is a look back, because that's what history is all about. And it includes for me a degree of pride, I think, of how the Cold War was overcome. And of course, it needs knowledge how that was achieved, with both diplomacy on the one hand and strength, NATO strength on the other hand, and how a new era started in 1990, culminating in the Charter of Paris, which, as we all know, was not the end of history, but worth to read anyway, and something very remarkable. But of course, the look back would not only include pride, but it would also include honesty with regard to shortcomings, like double standards in compliance with international law. And yes, I think an admittance by sort of my generation, the people who have been in responsible positions, an admittance that on the meta level, there might be some truth in the allegation that rules were created and followed as long as it served the purposes of powerful nations. And when that stopped, they were ignored. Now, that's, of course, a simplification, but there is, I think, a core of truth in that. And this might be most tangible with regard to the WTO rules. And Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala has said exactly that in so many words. But of course, it applies to other fields as well. So we have to acknowledge that's part of the sort of looking back over the last, let's say, 30, 40 years. I'm pretty confident, as I said before, that on the basis of such an honest, fact-based look on history, also the next generation of diplomats will come to the conclusion that the way forward is not the abolition of the UN system and its binding norms, but it is rather a rational reform of it and much more emphasis on consequential implementation. Maybe I should add a totally personal remark at the end. As regards personal qualities, I think that the right disposition for future diplomats is, or I think my advice might sound a bit old-fashioned and very simplistic, but it's always the same when I'm doing public appearances or similar. The basis for everything you do is solid information, facts and figures, separation of opinions from facts. Now that's quite easily said, but that is the basis for everything. So it's important for you to choose maybe an anchor for facts and figures and separating opinions from facts. And, despite all the AI tools, despite all the social platforms, which of course we attend, I think there is still something about the old-fashioned newspaper that you trust, that is the anchor for that. So I would actually recommend you choose a trusted anchor for facts and figures and separating opinions from facts. Whether that is the New York Times or any other medium is totally irrelevant, but you have to choose one you trust. And then, of course, you continue in your social platforms, you continue in your bubbles, where the algorithms throw you into, and you will continue, with lots of news sources, including, of course, the feed of your foreign ministry, which you have to read, which is all fine. But choose an anchor. Choose an anchor for separating opinions from facts, maybe where you like the opinions. Could be a good entry point, where I like the opinions, but they're separated from the facts. And that is your anchor during your career.
Joachim, I really appreciate that advice. And the good news for my students is that they have free subscriptions to the mainstream media. I've actually moved from the Wall Street Journal to the Financial Times just because they have a particularly quirky perspective on the United States. And they're not picking one side in the cultural wars of the blue versus red baseball caps in the United States. So I've shifted off. And as an economist, I know you'll appreciate that. My morning read is the
I appreciate that.
Yeah. With the time zone, it gets to my inbox early in the morning. Well, Joachim, this has been a very interesting, a very rich conversation with lots of ideas and thoughts about the United Nations, human rights, artificial intelligence, and practical suggestions for mindsets and homework for young professionals. So it's been a real honor and a privilege to work with you in PLPG as a senior peace fellow on all of the various projects that we're engaged on. And I've really enjoyed having this conversation. And I know our listeners will appreciate the privilege of hearing your thoughts and ideas. So thank you very much, Joachim, for joining us and for all the great work that you do.
Thank you for inviting me, and I feel very proud being part of this group.